Hi, this is Ted Pattison with part 2 of the Power BI Developer's Guide to Azure AD Security. In this section, we're going to look at the Microsoft Identity Platform 2.0. And now let's move on to where the rubber hits the road and talk about how we're actually going to implement authentication flows with Azure AD in the Microsoft Identity Platform 2.0. Now, our goal to acquire an access token and implement an authentication flow, is to be able to call into Azure Active Directory and get back our access token. And that's the key to being able to then call to the Power BI Service API. However, one issue is that we have to pick between the old way of doing this and the new way. So Microsoft released their first implementation of OAuth and OpenID Connect many years ago, and it's what we now call the Azure AD v1 endpoint. Well, now, last year, in May of 2019, Microsoft basically released a second endpoint with an improved implementation of OAuth. So which one do we use? So the v1 endpoint has been heavily used over the last few years. And if you're going to use it, you're going to use the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADL. Okay, that's what many of you might have already used. The new one, to access the Azure AD v2.0 endpoint, well, now we're going to use the Microsoft Authentication Library, or MSAL. So Microsoft, definitely the identity team that manages security within the Microsoft development communities, are pushing everyone to move to the v2 endpoint. Now, it's not critical that you move over tomorrow, but there are definitely good reasons to move to the v2 endpoint and use MSAL instead of ADL. The main reason will be dynamic incremental consent. And when I start doing my demos, that will come out. But the idea is with the 1.0 endpoint, you had one shot to ask the user what delegated permissions they wanted to consent to. And if later on you needed more, there was no elegant way to basically have the user gradually consent to more and more permissions. Yet with the 2.0 endpoint, the API has been refactored to make this a much more natural way to work with scopes and OAuth 2.0. If you're going to be developing with Azure AD, you have to get used to working with the Azure portal. So it's available at https://portal.azure.com. And you don't require an Azure subscription to be able to create applications. You basically just need to have a user account within the tenant that you're doing your development work in. Now, we're going to be able to go there, and if we want to create a new application by hand, there is the new application button. Note that when you create a new application, you have to create it either as a public client or as a web client. And the idea is that you're picking between a public client and a confidential web client. And note that sometimes you have to supply a redirect URI, sometimes you don't. So it's not always required. Now, another important thing to note is that when we create Azure AD applications, an Azure AD application can be basically used across many different tenants. It can be multi-tenant. And so for that reason, they have to create a second object, which is known as a service principal. So while the application kind of represents a global definition of the application, and that application ID is seen once across all tenants, they also create a local tenant representation, which is known as the service principal. And if you see the GUID for the object ID for your application, that's the service principal. And if the same application is used across many tenants, the object ID will be different. The application ID will be the same. Now, once you've created an application in the Azure AD portal, you can configure all aspects of authentication. You can basically configure certificates and secrets, API permissions. Also note that once you create an application, you're going to be able to see the application ID, also known as the client ID, and the object ID. So you can basically figure out, what those two GUIDs are if you need them for your development work. Now, it's also possible to configure permissions for an application once you have created it. And note that if you're using the v1 endpoint and ADL, typically you had to do that because you basically set what permissions you needed, as part of your application configuration. And then you had this one-time shot to basically have the user consent. Now, with the v2 endpoint, registering permissions with your application is completely optional. In fact, we don't do it a lot because when we request an access token, your application basically passes the scopes that it needs at runtime. So here I am at the Azure portal. Notice that I can drill down to Azure Active Directory. Once we get there, over on the left, there is app registrations. And here are all my app registrations, of which there are none. So let's say I click New Registration. And so this is my first client app. And as I create my first client app, I decide whether it's single tenant or multi-tenant. And then down here is where I pick between a public client or a confidential web client. In this case right here, let's go ahead and create a public client, and I'll put a redirect URL. I'll click on register, and now the application is created. There's the application ID, there is the service principal ID. If I need to configure other aspects of authentication or client secrets or API permissions, I can do that here. Okay, it might be much easier though to use PowerShell. Let's go look at this PowerShell application. So there is a set of commandlets for Azure AD. So we're going to say connect Azure AD. Here's a technique that you can hard code your username and password right into your development time scripts. And in our case right here, we're going to create a new Azure AD application. Now, once we do that, note that you can basically discover what the GUID is, the application ID, aka client ID, as part of your PowerShell script. So note that we're going to go ahead and run this script right here. And one of the things my script is going to do is it's going to go ahead and create a text document that has the application ID and the redirect URI that I'm going to need to copy, into my application that I'm going to be developing in Visual Studio. If we go back over here and we go ahead and we take a look at what my script has just created, well, here's what it just created. It created this brand new app. There's the app ID of 1AF. I go back over here and I have 1AF. And now that we've created a new Azure AD application and we have the application ID, we can now write an application against it to authenticate and acquire an access token. And for that, we're going to use the Microsoft Authentication Library, the .NET version. Now remember that MSAL provides assistance with authentication through the new Azure AD V2 endpoint, not the V1 endpoint. Now, another thing to note is that when we want to use this library in a Visual Studio project, you add the NuGet package Microsoft.identity.client. Now, note that it's very different from the Active Directory Authentication Library in the fact that they have different builder classes for building applications, and they differentiate between public clients and confidential web clients. Now, another really nice thing about MSAL is it provides built-in support for token caching and for silent token acquisition, and we'll see an example of that coming up. Another big change when you're moving from ADL over to MSAL is the fact that now you deal explicitly with scopes. So you're going to have a lot of string arrays that basically define a set of delegated permissions, which you're going to basically pass to the authorization server, Azure AD, as you implement an authentication flow. Here's our first look at how to get a token in an interactive fashion from a desktop application. So note that there is a public client application builder, and once we build the application builder, we then call build to create the actual application. Once we've created the application, there are a number of different methods, and the one we're looking at here is acquire token interactive. And this is going to basically provide the user with an interactive experience so that the user can basically put in credentials and authenticate, and if necessary, also consent to the delegated permissions that have been required by the application. And note that this method here that we've created, kind of a generic get access token interactive, it takes scopes as an incoming parameter, and when it gets an access token, it will make sure that we get an access token with those scopes. Okay, let's examine our first sample application. So this is a .NET Framework console application. And note, if I looked at the NuGet packages, the NuGet packages we'd be able to find are one, the Microsoft Authentication Library, Microsoft Identity.Client, and we're also going to use the Power BI SDK. It's basically a .NET wrapper that makes it easier to call into the Power BI Service SDK. So let's begin by taking a look at the app.config file, and note that we have to take the application ID and the redirect URI of our application, and our application has to know about those. Okay, second, let's look over here. We have a class which is Power BI permission scopes. And this just gives me an easy way to organize the sets of permissions that I need to request when I get an access token. And so, for instance, there's one, read workspace assets, where we get dashboard, read all, report read all, dataset read all. Another one, which is read user workspaces, which is group read all. Now, when I want to use a permission scope, let's go look at this client application over here. And what you'll note is that I can simply do something such as call permission scopes, and then I can say read workspace assets. And now I have an easy way to get the permission scopes that I want and pass it to the other method that's going to be implementing the authentication flow. Now, there's another class called Token Manager. And here we have the Get Access Token Interactive. And so here we're going to create an application builder with the authority. Note that we don't have to put in an authority name specific to my tenant because we can use a generic common authority. And the idea is you don't know what tenant you have before the user has authenticated, but once the user is authenticated, the user had to authenticate with one specific tenant. So you can basically discover that afterwards. Also note that we're going to use an interactive authentication flow that requires we pass a redirect URI. And while the redirect URI doesn't have to be an actual location on the internet, we do have to register a redirect URI, and then when we implement the authentication flow, we have to pass a redirect URI that matches one that's been authenticated. Okay, now let's go ahead and test this out. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and get a Power BI client. So notice that here, even though we're calling Get Access Token Interactive, we have a little wrapper method, which is called Get Power BI Client Interactive. And the idea here is that we then wrap kind of the Power BI SDK wrapper object, which is called PBI Client. Just makes it easier to call into the API itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this application. Now, when we run the application, it's going to try to get an access token. Note that when it gets the access token inside here, in fact, let's go ahead and bring Fiddler up so we can kind of see behind the scenes. So here, it is going to prompt the user to log in. The user now logs in, and because it's the first time and the user has never consented to permissions, it's going to make the user basically go through this consent process. The user now chooses accept, and now the application should run and give me back the reports that I need inside here. Okay. Now also note that I can see the reports. Also note that let's go ahead and stop and run the application one more time. And the second time we run it, we shouldn't be prompted to consent because we've already consented to those permissions. So that remember that when the application runs, it doesn't need to have me consent this time. Now here's where interactive or incremental dynamic consent comes in. So let's say we've run that, and so far the user has basically consented to permissions that you saw in read workspace assets. So now let's go ahead and comment this one out, and let's call something else. This time we're going to do another interactive authentication, but now we're going to pick different scopes. In particular, this time we're going to ask for read user workspace. Now we run the application again, and once again the user is prompted to log in, but now we're asking for more permissions than the user has consented to. We're basically incrementing the consent that we're asking for the user, and so as long as you know how to add additional scopes in an interactive request, the user is then prompted to consent to the additional permissions. We choose OK, and the application runs, and we get back our data. Now, if we look back here at what's happening as we get our access tokens, you can see that there are these requests that are going across, and you can see that there's the request, there are the things that are being requested. The Microsoft Authentication Library is doing wonderful things to abstract away me having to create HTTP requests that pass things like the client ID and the scope inside there. And then coming back, you can see there's the access token, there's the ID token, there's the refresh token. Everything is being cached. So you already love implementing an authentication flow with Azure AD. But wait, there's more. The Microsoft Authentication Library brings with it support for token caching. Now you have to give it a little help. So here's an example of a demo token cache helper class. And note that in this case, since it's a desktop application, we're simply going to be serializing it into a file, which is fine for desktop applications. As you move to web applications, the place that you cache the tokens, gets to be a lot more tricky. But what we're going to first of all do is we have a token helper class, and then after you create your application with MSAL, you then have to call a method to kind of connect the application to the token cache. Now, once we've done that and we have the token cache hooked up, we can use a different style to authenticate. We can basically use a method, and you can kind of see it here in my example, which is called acquire token silent. And the idea is it looks in the token cache, and if it can find the token cache inside there, it just uses it. If it looks inside the token cache, finds that the access token has expired, it will then use a refresh token to silently call across the network and obtain a new access token. Now, there are cases where you can't acquire a token silently because we require interactive use. So what this method does, it will then fall back on acquire token by username and password and basically use the user password credential flow. If that doesn't work, then we basically go down to acquire token interactive. Now let's take a quick look at the Power BI permission scopes class in the models folder. So here I basically created a couple different static fields based on string arrays with the combined permission sets or scopes that I might need when I acquire an access token. For instance, if I wanted just to get the default permissions that were registered along with the application, I can use this particular scope. However, typically we're just going to ask for what we want. So for instance, here is a name permission set, which is read workspace assets. Here's another one, read user workspaces. Now let's go back to our client code and note that when it comes time to acquire an access token, we can simply now call one of our particular permission sets by name, since we have this convenient class. Now the next thing we're going to look at is the token manager class, and in particular, let's look at get token interactive. So once again, here's the code that you saw on the slides, and we're basically creating a public client, and we're going to acquire a token interactively. Now, we also have a second method down here, which is get Power BI client interactive. So here, we're just doing typical Power BI programming by taking that access token and wrapping it with a particular REST authorization header object, and then creating the wrapper Power BI client. Okay, so back here, let's go ahead and run our first sample. So what we're going to do is we're going to call into the token manager, get Power BI client interactive, and we're going to pass in the scopes that we want. So we'll go ahead and we will run the application. And note that as we run the application and we sign in, now because it's the first time that we've used this particular application, it's the first time we've requested those scopes, it now should prompt me to consent. And so remember that when the user has to consent, you have to use an authentication flow that allows this type of interactive behavior. We'll go ahead, we'll choose accept, and now the application runs. Now let's run it one more time. So I'm instantly going to run it again, and note that here it's causing me to interactively log in. And let's go ahead and log in right here. But note that after we log in, we don't need to basically consent to anything because we've already consented to the same 3 permissions that we requested in this second time. Okay, now let's look for something that is going to require a little bit more permissions, or at least different permissions from what we've already asked for. So far we've asked for a permission set, which is read workspace assets. So now let's go ahead and execute a second method right here. And this one is going to ask for the readability to basically read all the app workspaces that the current user is a member of. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this right here. And what we should see here is that this time when we run and we go ahead and we interactively log in, we should get a different experience because now we're asking for more permissions than the user's consented to. So this is the dynamic incremental consent that V2, the V2 endpoint, gives us in a very easy, elegant way, and that is basically just a hard thing to achieve with the V1 endpoint when you're using the Active Directory Authentication Library. Let's go ahead and accept, and now it runs the application, and I get back what I need. So another authentication flow supported by the Microsoft Authentication Library is user credential password flow. So this is where you hard code a username and password, or you secure it in some way, and you pass that at runtime. Now, Microsoft recommends against using this flow in production scenarios. Of all the flows, it's the most inherently unsafe because the password has to be passed across the network. But in cases where you're developing and you're tired of logging in 1,000 times as you're testing a console application, it could be a good approach for that. And then also, when we use user credential password flow, it just sends a request right to the V2 token endpoint to get back an access token, and there's no opportunity for interactive behavior. So if you request an access token that has a delegated permission the user hasn't consented to, this will just fail and doesn't really give you any chance to recover. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is really, really neat. This will bring out the inner geek within you. Well, Microsoft Authentication Library automatically supports token caching. And you have to add a little bit of help. So we're going to add a token helper class, and this is going to create a separate file. And we're just going to basically find the exe file and create a cache file right next to it with the exact same name, plus a little bit extra on the extension. We're going to need to use some kind of a locking mechanism so that when we enable serialization, we don't have two things writing into the same file at the same time. But there's basically going to be two methods: before access notified and after access modified. And that's where you either read the data from the store to basically populate the token cache at the beginning of request, or if the user has just done something to acquire a new access token, you need to basically write that new information to the cache, and that's what we have in after access notification. Now, we're going to use this sample class, and now when you hook it up, it's pretty easy. What we're going to do is we're going to call token cache helper enable serialization. We're going to basically pass in the user token cache for the application we've just created, and that basically hooks it up. And what you're going to see is that when we hook that up, we're going to automatically have just basically a database of token caching that gets built behind the scenes, and it gets to be really easy to demo, because we're creating it inside of a JSON text file. Now, once we get the token cache working, we have some new options. So look at this method right here. We're trying to get an access token, and it's generic. Someone passes us a set of scopes, and then on our first attempt, we're going to basically making a call to acquire token silent. Now, before I can call acquire token silent, I have to say for which user I'm basically reaching into the cache for. Now, with the desktop application, we generally assume that it's just going to run as the current user. So once you've logged in and you continue to use it, there's just one account. When we get to a web application later, you'll see there's a lot more complication. But the idea is that if we call acquire token silent, if there is a token in the cache that meets our needs, it gives it to us. If the token has expired, behind the scenes, it uses a refresh token to automatically redeem a new access token and passes that back to me. And even in cases where there's an access token in the cache, but it doesn't have the permissions that I need, the scopes, it will then basically, behind the scenes, call across the network, get a new access token, and pass it back. Now, there are definitely times where acquire token silent will not work because there's no token in the cache yet. So then what we're going to do is fall back. And so we have a try catch block. Now, the second attempt here, I'm going to use acquire token by username. You can add that in. You can take it out if you want. But now the third attempt is going to be to do the interactive. So if both the first two fail, then we do an interactive login. And quite often, that's what is required, for us to pick up the fact that we have asked for an access token and the user hasn't consented to all the permissions that we need inside there. Okay, let's see how all this fits together in the demo. Okay, back to our sample. So now we're going to look at the final method, get access token. And this one is going to use the code we just saw on the slide. Note that the token cache helper is a subclass of the token manager class. We can use that if we want. But what we're going to do is we're going to call this method. We're going to hook up the cache, and then we're going to try to get the token silently. If not silently, get it by username and password. If not, get it interactively. Now, another thing that we're going to do in this case here is now we're going to call a method that is going to get a access token for the first Power BI client object, and then we're going to ask for different permissions and get another access token for this one right here. Okay, now also let's go ahead and open Fiddler for this demo, and note that when you open Fiddler, you can also specify under filters, only give me things that are going to login.microsoft.com, api.powerbi.com, and localhost. Let's go ahead and run that filter set now. Okay, and now let's go ahead and run this. And so as we run the application right here, one of the things that we're going to see, and let me kind of position things so we can see more things at once over here. Let's get Fiddler back on the screen. And so now what we're going to do is let's go ahead and log in. And so as we log in right here, and now we've signed in, now what we're going to see is that it's able to get back an access token, and then it's able to use that access token to make calls, but note that, let's go back, and now let's go ahead and stop for a second, and let's see where the token cache is. So let's go show all files for my project. I'm going to drill down to the bin debug, and there is the token cache. And so it is Power BI public client.exe, .tokencache.json. Let's go ahead and include that inside my project so now I can close this back up. And now let's use the wonderful Visual Studio keystroke, Control KD, to reformat. And now here is the token cache. And the idea is that let's go ahead and test it one more time. So what's kind of neat is that I can basically take this token cache and just delete it and save it. And so now my sample application will see there's no cache and we'll have to create it. So now let's go back here and run this right here. So now, once again, let's bring up Fiddler. And inside of Fiddler, we'll go ahead and remove everything. And now we'll go ahead and we'll run this. And this time as we run the application, and I'll go ahead and put in my password, and note that, let's go back here and kind of see that the second I get back my first access token, what's going to happen is that they're automatically going to take that and put it, into the cache. And then future calls, can go through that particular cache. So here you can basically see that we've gotten a token back. If you want to see what a token looks like, inside of the browser, if we go back here, and now here is the auth result, here's the access token. Another geek trick, if you take an access token and you right click and say send to the text wizard, and then up here we're just going to take the access token equals and we're going to trim that off. And now what you're able to do is you're able to kind of reach in here and basically figure out, that is the actual access token. Okay, and now we've got an access token in the cache. Life is good. Let's go back here. Let's run our application a couple more times. And note that now we can run it and it doesn't require me to log in. I'll run it once, I'll run it twice. And what we can see here is now when we go back to Fiddler, we're just making calls to the Power BI Service API. We no longer have to call into Azure AD because we've acquired a token and we basically are able just to pull the token out of the cache each time. Well, congratulations. You've made it through part 2 of the Power BI Developer's Guide to Azure AD Security, and you know a lot more about the Microsoft Identity Platform 2.0. So now let's move ahead to part 3, where we're going to talk about developing with the Power BI.NET SDK.